Hello and welcome to the Old Weird Books channel. Today we are going to be starting our second book in the series. This book is called Boy's Book of Sea Battles by Chelsea Curtis Fraser, a Falcon book. This one obviously is in very poor condition, as are most of the books that I possess. We can see that it has previously had the binding repaired, and there's quite a bit of missing paper on the back, as well as a lot of writing. We have things like previous owners' names, the words giveaway. I believe that this is an address with a zip code. I can't read the city. It is in very poor condition. We can see that it was on a giveaway at some point. Looks like it was at Grubbs Elementary Library at some point. And again, we have a list of children that have owned or at least written in this book. Some of the pages have been cut for various reasons in the past. I did notice that this did have a library card in the back. Most of the dates are from 1969, with this last one appearing to be from 1972. So we've got the Boy's Book of Sea Battles by Chelsea Curtis Fraser, and it says, "Truth can be exciting, or can be more exciting than fiction, as these 14 stirring sea battles from the pages of history prove. From the days of Sir Francis Drake, when life on sea was a constant battle between the Spanish and the English, to the Battle of Leyte, sea fights have determined the destiny of men and nations. In these pages you will find Commodore John Paul Jones, Lord Nelson, Oliver Perry, Admiral David Farragut, and Dewey, together with the dramatic stories of the Constitution, the Gruyere, the Monitor, and the Merrimac, and the sea battles of World Wars I and II. These stories of ships and the heroes who man them will appeal to every adventurous heart." And it goes on to list additional books by Falcon for boys. So again, we're seeing this concept where it's assumed that only boys want to read about sea battles. So we've got The Spirit of the Border, Through Forest and Stream, The Strikeout King, On the 40-Yard Line, Over the Hurdles, The Winning Basket, and the Mercer Boys series. We've got a picture in here. Clearly somebody has come in here with what looks like crayon and added their own splash of color to these pages. Below it says, "He opened up on the Bucenture with terrific fire." And then we have, of course, the title page, Boy's Book of Sea Battles by Chelsea Fraser, with maps by the author. Not sure what the 1679 is. It may be some sort of a library notation. The World Publishing Company in Cleveland and New York. Falcon books are published by the World Publishing Company at 2231 West 110th Street, Cleveland, 2, Ohio. We've got a code down here, 3WP453, copyright of 1950 by the World Publishing Company, manufactured in the United States of America. We've got our contents page listing the 14 different stories that we're going to have. Sir Francis Drake, Commodore John Paul Jones, Lord Horatio Nelson, The Burning of the Philadelphia, Perry's Victory on Lake Erie, The Constitution and the Gruyere, I cannot pronounce that language, The Ship That Disappeared, The Monitor and the Merrimac, Admiral David Farragut, Dewey at Manila Bay, the Battle of Santiago Harbor, the Battle of Jutland Bank, the Invasion of Normandy, and the Battle of Leyte Gulf. So we'll go ahead and get into here. We'll read our first story, as I've done with the other books on this channel. As I go through and read, I'm only going to do one section at a time. That way we don't have a super long video that needs to be put out, and you can just listen to individual stories without having to jump pages or try and fast forward through the videos. So our first story, Sir Francis Drake. The man in the crow's nest scrambled frantically down the ropes and rushed to Captain William Hawkins' side. "Ships, sir!" he cried. "Spanish ships to starboard! A whole fleet!" Captain Hawkins grabbed his spyglass and leaned over the rail of his small ship to see for himself. He turned from the rail. "Send young Drake to me," he ordered. "Summon the crew." Several days ago, Hawkins had guided his tiny fleet into the harbor of Rio de la Hacha to exchange slaves from the Guinea coast of Africa for a king's ransom in gold, silver, pearls, sugar, and hides. Then, the night before, Hawkins, with a squadron of 3 small ships, had come to Vera Cruz. Now he gazed ruefully at the 12 Spanish merchant ships idling in the Vera Cruz harbor. They were unarmed and each worth a fortune in cargo. He shook his head slowly. Hawkins' fleet had sailed to Vera Cruz to escape a hurricane which had prevented their immediate return to England. The 12 Spanish merchantmen lay in the harbor when they arrived. Hawkins, the pirate, itched to lay his hands on their cargo, but he hesitated. And this morning, here came the armed men of war to convey the Spaniards back to safety. Young Francis Drake appeared at his captain's elbow. His black eyes were sparkling with the promise of more adventure. His black curls, tied back with a red handkerchief, waved jauntily in the breeze. "The Spanish convoy has arrived, Drake," Hawkins said. "I know, Captain," Drake replied. "Shall I give the orders to fire?" "Wait, lad," Hawkins said. "I think we shall ask for a safe conduct." Drake stared at his captain. "Safe conduct? When there is a king's fortune aboard those merchantmen? When we can shed more Spanish blood?" "We have a king's ransom below," Hawkins reminded the boy gently. "Our mission is done here." Drake's black eyes snapped angrily. "What will the Queen think when you tell her that you let $2 million of gold fall into the hands of Philip?" Hawkins laid a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You are a simple sailor, Drake, and not much for politics. What would the Queen think if we returned to England with that loot?" "She would love it. She would dress herself and her court in greater finery than she has ever known before," Drake answered. "And when the Spanish ambassador paid her a visit to demand retribution, would she fight a war because of our mischief? Think, boy. It would be far simpler to fasten a noose around our necks and hang us for piracy." Drake shook his head. "But the Queen gave us money for this expedition. She must have known we would run into trouble with the Spaniards." Hawkins sighed. "The ways of our good Queen Bess are sometimes hard to understand. She has hanged others for piracy when the Spaniards demanded their hides. As for me, I'll take my chances in a fight with any Spaniard who comes along. But I've no desire to fit my neck into an English noose. Return to your ship, lad, and stand by for my orders." Reluctantly, Drake let himself over the side of the Minion and rowed to his ship, the Judith. The Spanish men of war were sailing into the harbor, and Hawkins sent orders to have a small boat sent out to meet them. Like a doomed man, Drake watched the Spanish ships sail into the harbor. He and Hawkins both knew that the Spaniards were not to be trusted. Grimly, he braced himself to face the attack which he knew would come as soon as the men of war entered the harbor. He didn't have long to wait. With terrible violence, the Spaniards opened fire, broadsides on the small English ships. Drake shouted quick orders to his men and opened fire in return. He could barely see Hawkins' minion through the smoke of the battle, but he could make out a large Spanish galleon bearing down on him, its crew reaching out for his ship with grappling irons. Drake and his men leaped to the rail of the deck, armed with bows and arrows and small guns. No Spaniard would set foot on his ship, Drake vowed fiercely. The little English ship poured round after round into the side of the approaching man of war. Finally, the Spaniard retreated, and Drake gave orders to sail for the open sea. The Judith reached the sea and safety, but Drake was beside himself with fury. His ship was badly damaged, His men were wounded and exhausted, and worst of all, the tiny Jesus and the smaller boats carrying the English cargo were lost. The Judith and the Minion, both nearly beyond repair, set sail for England. Through the long days of their voyage home, Drake nursed his hatred of the Spanish. It was a long-standing hatred dating back as far as the boy could remember. Every sailor in England shared his feelings, just as every Spanish sailor despised the English. Spain was and had been the mistress of the seas for over a century. She had opened up the New World and had built a tremendous fleet of merchant ships to carry the New World treasures back to Madrid. And she had built a navy large enough to defend this little lifeline between the old country and the new. And what did England have in the way of navy? Drake asked himself bitterly, except a few men of war and a few merchant ships, which were armed and sent into battle in wartime. Of course the merchant ships didn't necessarily disarm in peacetime. The Minion and the Judith were proof of that. There was no war between Spain and England now, but there wasn't peace either. Ever since Drake had been born in 1544, there had been undeclared civil war and struggle with Spain. It was partially for religious reasons. England became Protestant after Edward VI and Catholic again under Mary Tudor, wife of the Spanish king, and Protestant once again under Elizabeth. Drake knew about this side of the picture too. His father, Edmund Drake, had been a Protestant preacher in Devon, a Catholic stronghold, and he had been forced to escape to St. Nicholas Island in Plymouth Harbor, where he was appointed Reader of Prayers to the Royal Navy. It was here that Francis learned to love the sea. He lived aboard a rotting hulk in the harbor and grew up with the retired sailors who spun yarns about the fabulous new lands beyond the horizon. It was from his father that he inherited his fanatical hatred of everything Catholic and Spanish. Francis Drake was well equipped to become a merchant seaman in Her Majesty's Navy, or, as the Spaniard claimed, an English pirate. Plundering the Spanish Main. Young Francis fumed and fretted in Plymouth, waiting for a sailing commission from Queen Elizabeth. 3 years later, in 1570, the commission came through, and Drake fitted out a small fleet together with his brother, Captain John Drake. For 2 years, he cruised in the West Indies, plundering Spanish ships and making his name a terror to the Spanish and their colonists. 2 years later, he enlisted the aid of his brother John and returned to the New World. Older captains were wary of the cruise the two brothers were attempting. The Pasha, Drake's flagship, was only 70 tons, and the Swan, captained by John, was a bare 25 tons. The ships were the size of toys, and the crew of 73 were boys. Only one man was over 30 years old. Drake sailed for Guadalupe in the West Indies and ushered his ships into Port Pleasant, a small harbor in the Gulf of Darien. Here he joined forces with Ned Horsey and Captain Rance, other English pirates who were terrorizing the Spanish Main. Together they plundered Nombre de Dios, the treasure house of the Spaniards in the West Indies. Here they found gold and silver bars and precious stones piled to the ceilings of the storehouses. But Drake had been wounded in one of the forays with the Spanish, and a furious tropical storm ruined their weapons. In vain, Drake taunted and begged his men to take the treasure. Finally, he stumbled and fell, and the wound in his leg reopened. Protesting, he was carried back to his ship, and his men set sail for the pirate cove in the Gulf of Darien. As he recovered from his injury, Drake planned raids on the shipments of gold, which were carried in mule packs across the Isthmus of Panama to be shipped to Spain. And while he waited for the dry season, when these overland trips would be made, he sent his smaller ships out into the harbor to plunder passing ships and to raid the neighboring coast. Finally, the dry season arrived, and Drake's men attacked a mule train traveling the road to Veracruz. They attacked just a mile from the town, which was armed with Spaniards, but they struck with suddenness, panicked the mules, and frightened off the mule drivers and guards with little trouble. Packing all the treasure that they could carry, they buried the heavy gold and silver bars and set off for Rio Francisco. The familiar cry of Spanish ships warned Drake that his smaller ships had been chased out of the harbor and that an armed Spanish fleet was waiting for him. He stopped his men and ordered them to build a raft of driftwood. He chose 3 men to accompany him on the exhausting trip back to the cove hideout. The tiny raft was tossed about for 6 hours on a heavy sea, and then the sun came out and beat mercilessly down on the tired, drenched men. But when night came, the raft sailed successfully into the cove, and Drake didn't even bother to rest. He rowed back to Rio Francisco and brought the rest of his crew back safely to the cove. 2 weeks later, after they had loaded their booty onto their ships, they set sail for England. On their way home, they picked off a number of Spanish ships which had the bad luck to be in their course. Drake and his tiny crews soon became the toast of England. Hatred of the Spanish had been whipped into a fury, and Drake was the English sailor who was tormenting the Spaniards the most successfully. Time and time again, Drake plundered and looted the Spanish Main, and even sailed down around the Cape of South America, into the South Seas to raid Spanish ships and ports of the New World. He and his men suffered terrible hardships from storms, calms, and lack of food. His fleet headed into the Pacific Ocean, past the Caroline Islands and the Philippines. In the Sea of the Celebes, his ship ran on a sunken rock. 8 guns and 3 tons of cloves were heaved overboard to lighten the ship. A wind came up and the ship slid back into the deep water. Drake continued his around-the-world voyage in the Golden Hind, sailed around the Cape of Good Hope, and headed up the European coast. Just off the Plymouth coast, Drake was hailed by a scout coming from the mainland. The courier climbed over the rail of the Golden Hind and breathlessly reported, "You can't land, Captain Drake. Your neck will never be safe in England now." Drake shook the man. "I have a fortune in my holds. What do you mean I can't land?" "The Queen. She has disowned you. If you dare to land, she'll hang you, or worse, hand you over to the Spaniards. The Spanish ambassador has threatened war unless you are disposed of." Drake gazed across the harbor toward Plymouth. "I see," he said. "Her Majesty is still afraid to fight the Spaniards." He thought carefully. He was afraid of no man in an open sea fight, but to be hanged on an English gibbet or to be handed over to the Spanish Inquisition and its fearful tortures was another thing. He smiled grimly as he remembered Hawkins' advice of years ago. He had pushed his luck too far. Drake thanked the courier and sent him to the mainland. He ordered his fleet to take refuge behind St. Nicholas Island, where his father had fled from religious persecution 30 years ago. Day after day, Drake paced the deck of the Golden Hind and discussed the matter with his crew. "There will be war with Spain," he repeated to his men. "There will be war whether or not I am hanged. The Queen must know that." His men swallowed their protests against the Queen. They all knew that Drake, like his fellow pirates, loved and feared his monarch even when she outlawed them. Finally, Drake decided without the support of the Queen, his career would be ended. He had to chance a visit to her even if it meant the end of his life. He sent a messenger to London, and he ordered a train of booty to be sent to the palace. Elizabeth's love of money was her vulnerable spot. It was his only chance. The messenger did a good job of paving the way for Drake's regaining favor with Elizabeth. He filled her treasury with the great treasure Drake had brought home, and he told her the stories of Drake's daring voyage around the world. Finally, Elizabeth sent for the pirate. Drake was still wary when he made the trip to London. He was afraid as he had never been before in his life when he was ushered into the Queen's presence. Humbly, he knelt before her and waited for her to speak. "You realize, Captain," the tall, gaunt woman said, "that if I spare your life, the Spaniards will be infuriated, perhaps to the point of declaring war. You have pirated your way around the world and have disgraced the honor of your country." Drake remained on his knees, waiting for the awful sentence of death. "But," Elizabeth continued, "if I should hang you, I would almost certainly have a civil war on my hands. You have been in England only for a few days, but already the tales of your journeys have been spread across the country. What shall I do with you?" Drake dared to answer. "My one wish was to serve your Majesty." The Queen's face was grim, but her eyes were sparkling. "And you have made me and my country very wealthy. Get off your knees, pirate." Dazed, Drake stood up. Elizabeth broke into a guffaw of laughter. "Now tell me, ruffian," she said, "the story of your capture of that Spanish galleon off the coast of Valparaiso." Drake recounted the incident of meeting the Grand Captain of the South near the tip of South America. "They didn't recognize our flag," he said. "No English ship had ever sailed those waters before. We boarded their ship to join our Spanish friends in a bottle of Chilean wine. Unfortunately, our hosts drank a bit too heavily. It was an easy matter to tumble them into the hatches and strip the vessel of their cargo of 30,000 ducats." Elizabeth roared with laughter. "And for this, Philip wishes you hanged? Perhaps you should be hanged, but not by me. Tomorrow I shall make a trip to see your flagship. Go, now, and prepare yourself for the ceremony. Your ship shall be preserved for all time as a memorial to the bravery of English sailors. And you, pirate, will be given the honor of knighthood." Sir Francis spent the next 5 years restlessly. He was a peer and the new mayor of Plymouth, and he learned something of public speaking and politics as he took his seat in Parliament to help with the organization of the Navy. But he was eager to return to the sea where he could continue his plundering career. For 5 years, Elizabeth kept him landlocked. Drake was grimly amused at her solution to the problem of handling her favorite pirate. To avoid a public uprising and to fill her treasury, she had chosen to knight him rather than hang him. But by knighting Drake, she was able to keep him occupied with land jobs and away from the Spanish Main. The Spaniards, to some degree, were appeased too. Philip of Spain, freed from the terror of Drake's piracy, began to plunder British ships. Enraged by the Spanish piracy, Elizabeth quickly sent Drake back to sea with the largest privateering squadron that ever was assembled. Drake headed straight for the West Indies in his flagship, the Elizabeth Bonaventura. He raided the Bayona Islands to supply his troops adequately with food, and then went on to San Domingo, the largest and most important city in the West Indies. Drake realized that the fall of San Domingo would have a powerful moral effect all over Europe, so he planned his attack carefully. He captured the town, demanded a ransom of $250,000, destroyed the Spanish ships in the harbor, and sailed away. Cartagena, capital of the Main and one of the wealthiest cities in the New World, was next to fall. Although Drake's fleet was larger than any he had ever commanded before, it was very small compared to the fleet and land forces which guarded the city. But Drake found a weak spot in the city's defense and took the city in a surprise attack. He didn't loot the rich treasury, but he took a mere $150,000. The Spaniards were glad to pay the ransom and get rid of the pirate. When sickness broke out among Drake's men, he decided against a proposed attack of Panama and headed for England. He was satisfied that the Spaniards would hesitate before attacking English merchant ships again. The defeat of the Spanish Armada. Philip of Spain was goaded into an all-out attack on England. The King of France and the Pope aided and urged Philip to put an end to the Protestant upstart who had cut her country off from the rest of the Catholic world, and who had openly and secretly helped Protestant countries in Northern Europe rebel against the Holy Roman Empire. Philip needed no urging to attack England. He was enraged and frightened by the great amount of wealth from the New World which were going into the British treasury instead of his own. Until British sailors such as Drake and Hawkins could be cleared from the seas, the colonies in the New World were in constant danger. The Great Spanish Armada was carefully and slowly assembled. Philip sent out word that he was sending the great navy to the Indies to make further conquests of the natives. But Drake was not fooled. He pointed out to Elizabeth the probability of an attack on England. He had crippled a good part of the Spanish navy in his last trip to the Indies, and he begged Elizabeth to build up the English navy to meet an attack while the Spanish rebuilt their fleet. On the afternoon of July 19, 1588, the Armada was first sighted. A group of English captains were bowling on the green at Plymouth when Drake noticed a small armed ship racing for the coast. With Drake on the bowling green were Sir John Hawkins, Sir Martin Frobisher, earliest explorer of the Arctic seas, Lord Howard of Effingham, High Admiral of England, and Sir Walter Raleigh, who was then in charge of the land forces of Cornwall. It was a rough gang of pirates and explorers who had recently been knighted by the Queen, and it was the strength of England's sea and land power which stood with Drake as he watched the small ship approach. "'Tis none less I see than Fleming and his privateer coming yonder," Drake cried to his fellow officers. "A penny to know what could induce such speed from the lazy Scotsman." Fleming jumped from his boat and ran to the group of officers, crying that he had spotted the Spanish Armada off the Cornish coast that morning. Quickly the officers went into action. Raleigh dispatched messengers to warn all English towns and villages that the enemy was approaching. Armies were quickly called up to back the fleet, which immediately prepared to sail out to meet the Armada. 152 English ships, some of them provided by the Dutch, manned by 17,000 men, hoisted their flags and sailed into the Channel. Most of the ships were merchantmen. All were light and easily managed. The Armada swung into the Channel. It was a fleet of 150 warships carrying 8,000 sailors, 20,000 soldiers, and over 2,000 slaves, and a large number of noblemen and volunteers. The Armada was primarily a convoy for soldiers. The Spaniards expected to land at a tip-off the coast and unload their soldiers to conquer England by land fighting. The ships were large and well built to withstand attack, but they were difficult to navigate because of their size and awkward shape. Nevertheless, the Armada was an impressive sight as it drew up before the British in the form of a giant crescent whose tips were 7 miles apart. Drake and the other captains guided their ships around to the rear of the great fleet when they attacked together from behind. As the firing started, Drake yelled to his men to keep a good distance away from the ships they were attacking. It was one thing to outmaneuver these hulking giants in a sea battle. It would have been another to try to fight the Spanish soldiers if they got close enough to board the English ships. Drake sailed around and around the huge men of war, and his veteran seamen scored hits with every shot. Each ship Drake attacked tried to close in on him. He could see the sailors manning their grappling irons as the ship bore down on him. The Spanish soldiers, their guns ready, were in formation to board his ship, but Drake laughed at them and gave the order to retreat. Quickly his ship slid back away from the large galleon. Before the Spaniards had a chance to change their course, Drake was at the back of the ship, pouring lead into the hull and shooting the confused men aboard. The Spaniards soon sailed away with the English in pursuit. The battle continued for days. Always Lord Howard and Sir Francis held their eager men back from hand-to-hand combat with the enemy. Each day the Spaniards were weakened, and each day added to the strength and numbers of the English. Raleigh returned with his troops together with Oxford, Cumberland, and Sheffield. The Spanish losses were heavy because they were excellent targets. The English losses were light because they provided no target at all with their speed and maneuvering ability. Fortunately for the Armada, it was under the leadership of a skillful and wise admiral. Otherwise, it would have immediately been cut to ribbons. But the Spanish admiral managed to guide his fleet comparatively unharmed to Calais roads, where it dropped anchor and waited for the Prince of Parma. Parma was to come by water from Dunkirk with a flotilla and a large invading army to supplement the soldiers carried by the fleet. But Dutch and English blockaders had held up Parma so that he was still far away from Calais roads when the Armada dropped anchor. The admiral arranged the fleet so that the largest and most impenetrable ships were on the outside of a giant circle. Lord Howard was forced to give up any idea of open attack. For 2 days, the two fleets were idle. Then, past midnight of the second day, 8 English ships sailed quietly into the Spanish circle and were set on fire. Drake himself captained one of the ships to be burned and rowed back to safety in a small boat. The sea suddenly was brilliant with the burning ships bearing down on the Spanish. As the 8 masses of flame came near, the Spanish became panic-stricken. Crews cut their cables to avoid the approaching fire. They sailed away in terror. Drake led the English pursuit, and daybreak found the Armada scattered all along the Flemish coast. Now the English were ready for open fighting. The British ships closed in on one after another of the Spanish galleons. Bravely, the Spanish hurled a few cannon shots at the oncoming British, but finally they gave up and drifted helplessly with the current toward the coast of Holland. A few galleons managed to escape the dreadful battle and sailed north. Here they ran into a fierce North Sea storm which destroyed them. The remnant of the colossal armada made its way wearily back to Spain, with the British in pursuit. Sir Francis Drake returned on his flagship to England, together with his fellow officers. His own ship had been hit 40 times, but neither this boat nor any other of consequence under his command had been seriously damaged. Only minor casualties had been suffered by the crews, and no officers had been wounded. Sir Francis had risen in the world, from simple seaman to pirate to second in command to the vice admiral. He had lifted himself up. And as he looked at the bits of Spanish wreckage strewing the channel, he realized that his country, too, had risen. In his lifetime, England had grown from a strife-ridden little island to this day when she could call herself undisputed mistress of the seas. With the blessing of the Queen, Drake again returned to the Caribbean islands. This time he sailed as a conqueror rather than a pirate to settle once and for all the conquest of the Spanish Main. He led his squadron to La Hacha and to Nombre de Dios, and then, in a sudden burst of adventurousness, he headed to Trujillo, the port of Honduras, and the rich towns of Nicaragua. But again the storms of the southern seas trapped him, and he was forced into the fatal Mosquito Gulf, where the fever was rampant. He, along with a good part of his crew, caught the fever. Lamely, they managed to make their way to Puerto Bello, where on January 28, 1596, Sir Francis Drake died and was buried at sea. Thank you so much for sitting through this very long story. We will have the next one up probably tomorrow, covering the Commodore John Paul Jones. Thank you so much for getting all the way to the end of this video. I do want to remind everyone that on this channel I am reading verbatim, so any words or phrases that are considered inappropriate or offensive are not any reflection of my personal or professional opinions and are just being read as they were written at the time. Thank you so much. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe to my channel, and I hope to see you back with the next video.